Now, some of this may look familiar since we did a character sketch on Joab last year. He's such a major character, there was too much material to squeeze into one session, so we're going to divide it up into 2 parts. And as with the other characters that we studied, we looked at things from their point of view, but since Joab is such an influential character, we're going to look at how he affected the lives around him, particularly his uncle David, who was to eventually become king. And the main question is, was Joab an asset or a liability to those that were around him? And so basically, he was like most of us. He was a mixed bag of both good and evil. And what would it have been like to depend upon a person like Joab? Many of us have worked with people who have not been team players, or worked with someone who was often insubordinate and still managed to achieve the desired objectives, and so still didn't lose his position. And we also know people who have held that the ends justify the means, which is not true. And many of us have had hot-tempered family members in our lives. We've also known people who have refused to forgive. And we've also known those who have been loyal one minute and disloyal the next. So basically, their loyalties were to themselves. And we've also known people who were master manipulators. And as you can look at Joab's life and see that he certainly had that quality among his spots. Now we're going to talk about Joab's origins. Joab was the son of one of David's sisters. David had 2 sisters, Abigail and Zeruiah, and Joab was the son of Zeruiah. Joab had 2 brothers, Abishai and Asahel. We don't know whether they all had the same father. Joab's father is unnamed. Was his father dead? He ran away. Did Joab even know who his father was? And Joab and his brothers were cited as the sons of Zeruiah. In Scripture, most of the time, men and women are described as sons of their, or daughters of their father. Occasionally, a woman might be cited as a daughter of her mother, but men were seldom cited in relation to their mother, and suggested that Joab's father just wasn't around. And here's the situation when Joab was born. Saul was king of Israel. Samuel was still alive, and his uncle David's star was rising. And the probable age difference between David and Joab is hard to tell. We do not know where Zeruiah fit in the birth order of David and his brothers and sisters. We know that David was the youngest of 8 boys that were recorded, number 8. Zeruiah could have been either older or younger than David. But since their father Jesse was an old man when David was anointed king by Samuel, Zeruiah was likely older than David. Since Jewish girls were married at a younger age in those days, Zeruiah could have given birth to Joab before her brother David was anointed by Samuel. It is likely that Joab was 10 to 15 years younger than his uncle, but he could have been even younger. We just don't know. Without a father around, Joab may have run off at the age of 14 when he was considered to be an adult. So it is possible that he was among the men who came to David when his uncle was first on the run from Saul, though it is more likely that Joab joined them somewhat later. Regardless, Joab, especially in his younger years, must have idolized his uncle, particularly after God's victory over Goliath that worked by David's hand. And wherever Joab went, his brother Abishai and probably Asahel followed. Since Asahel is not mentioned before the death of Saul, it may be that his mother Zeruiah kept him with her when Abishai followed Joab to serve their uncle David. Now since we don't know exactly when Joab joined David and his men, we're going to start when David was first on the run. 1 Samuel 22 verses 1 through 5, David had only a few men with him when he fled from Saul. It's not likely that Joab was among them. And then David and his few men fled to hide in a cave at Adullam, and David's brothers and his father's household met him there. It's possible that Joab and perhaps Abishai were among those who came to David there. And by this time, David's parents were considered to be elderly. And then David took his parents into Moab and asked the king of Moab to keep them safe. And then David realized that he needed to return back to the land of Judah. And in 1 Samuel 24, verses 1 through 22, read about David sparing Saul's life. Saul heard that David and his men were in the wilderness of En-Gedi, so he brought 3,000 men in pursuit. Meanwhile, David and his men were hiding in the recesses of a cave. Saul came in to relieve himself. He didn't send anyone in to check the cave to see whether it was safe. You know what they say, when you gotta go, you gotta go. If any of you have read The Hobbit, you read that when Forner and company were traveling through the misty mountains, in the midst of a bad storm, he sent 2 dwarves to seek for shelter. They returned shortly with a report of a cave. The Thorn knew that they had not taken time to thoroughly explore the cave, and he knew that caves were seldom unoccupied. But on that day, desperation won out. Of course, this decision led to the dwarves and Bilbo the Hobbit being captured by goblins. That's not what happened to Saul. Some of David's men encouraged him to kill Saul. Now, Joab and his brothers may have been among those who encouraged him. But he restrained his men from attacking Saul. God was not only testing David, he was testing his men to see whether they obeyed David's authority. But David, perhaps to mollify some of them, snuck over and cut off a piece of Saul's robe and then snuck back. And then after Saul left, David's conscience smote him, and he emerged from the cave and admitted to his deed. Now Saul admitted, of course, that he had been at David's mercy and David had spared him. And so Saul at that time had no other choice but to continue the pursuit. And in 1 Samuel 25, verses 1 through 13, we read about this where David was tempted to take matters in his own hand and then shed innocent blood. Now we don't know if he came to that on his own or if that was suggested to him. Anyway, Nabal was shearing his sheep and made a feast for his sheep shearers. And it was customary at such festivals to demonstrate generosity to neighbors and to benefactors. David sent 10 young men to Nabal to ask for provisions. He gave them a blessing and peace to Nabal and his household. He also reminded Nabal that when his men had been in the fields with Nabal's shepherds all through the season, they had not harmed his servant or stolen his property. And David's message contained the required politeness. Nabal refused David's polite and humble request. Nabal meant fool in Hebrew, and he lived down to his name. He implied that David was a traitor for abandoning his king. He refused to recognize the righteousness of David and his men in their treatment of him, his servants, and his property. He sent David's men back empty-handed and insulted. And verse Samuel 25, verses 14 through 35, we read that where David came close to shedding innocent blood. David's men reported back Nabal's words to him. David ordered his men to arm themselves. 400 men would go out to battle, while 200 would remain to guard what little supplies they had left. This was not typical behavior of David. Why did he behave like this? Although this is not recorded, some among his men, including Joab and his 2 brothers, might have incited David. But we also must realize that Samuel had just died, and David was at a low point, at a weak spot, grieving for the loss of his spiritual mentor. We see that once again God was testing David. Then, of course, we realize that Abigail, Nabal's wife, realized what was happening, and she quickly took action to mollify David, and David was grateful that she had come and prevented him from killing innocent blood during peacetime. And then again, David's spirit stole life again. 1 Samuel 26, verses 1 through 12. The Ziphites reported that David and his men were in the vicinity. This is the second time the Ziphites turned David and his men in, and this is especially bad after he and his men had just saved them from a Philistine attack. Saul came out with his army to pursue David and his men. But God cast Saul, Abner, and the entire army into a deep sleep. And David and his men came to Saul's camp while they were all asleep. Perfect opportunity, right? So David took Abishai, Joab's brother, into the camp. Abishai offered to kill Saul while he and his men were sleeping. David refused. So we see that Abishai was pretty much cut from the same cloth as Joab. At least that's what it appears to be. David ordered Abishai to pick up Saul's spear and the water jug, and they returned to David's men. And then David confronted Saul, calling out with a loud voice, condemning Abner for sleeping on the job. David related how he had come into Saul's camp, and his companion had urged him to kill the king. David held up the spear and the water jug to prove that he had had the opportunity to harm the king. Saul admitted the righteousness of David's actions. After sending a man to retrieve his spear, Saul and his men returned, discontinuing pursuit of David. David returned the spear this way for two reasons. First, with the whole camp awake, he didn't trust Saul or his officers not to arrest him or whoever he sent to return the spear. And second, returning the spear was a symbolic action that proved his continued loyalty to the king. But at this point, David decided his best bet was to leave Israelite territory. 1 Samuel 1, verses 29 through chapter 1, verse... Oh, sorry, I must be wrong anyway. That's something I need to correct. We read about the raid on Ziklag. Now, David became a vassal of Achish, king of Gath. David and his men offered their services to Achish, king of Gath, in Philistine territory. So David asked for a place in the country away from the royal court. Achish had granted to David the city of Ziklag, so he and his men had to move there and made it their home. Ziklag became David's base of operations, and he and his men raided the enemies of both Israel and Philistine. Meanwhile, the Amalekites had attacked Ziklag while David and his men had gone to Gath. The Philistines were planning an attack upon Saul, so Achish had called up David and his men. But the other Philistine leaders did not trust David and his men, so Achish sent them back to Ziklag. After being dismissed, David and his men returned to Ziklag, and they found the city burned with fire, and all the inhabitants gone, but there were no dead bodies. Some of David's men spoke of stoning David, but we can hope that Joab, Abishai, and Asahel were not among those. David and his men went in pursuit of the Amalekites. 600 men set out, but 200 were too weary to continue the pursuit. Remember, they had recently traveled from Gath to Ziklag, and they were weary from the travel. And when they returned home, they found their homes destroyed, their families gone. And so, in the midst of their grief, they wouldn't have had any time to rest. Time was of the essence. They had to go after the Amalekites as soon as they could. So David left the 200 men to wait behind to guard the baggage, while 400 men continued with him. David and his 400 men routed the Amalekites. They recovered the captives alive, as well as the plunder from Israelite and Philistine territory. So David kept part of the plunder for himself, but the remaining amount he divided among his men. And David and his 400 men returned to the 200 men who were guarding the baggage. Some among them said that the 200 men should each get their wives and children back and then be discharged for cowardice. Of course, again, we hope that Joab and his brothers were not among those who made that suggestion. But David shared the main amount of the plunder equally among his men, including the 200 who guarded the supplies, but did not fight the Amalekites. Then, in the meantime, Saul had died at the hands of the Philistines, and his 3 older brothers had died, and Ishbosheth had inherited the kingdom. But the tribe of Judah and probably Simeon made David their king, and David became king in Hebron. And then we read about the battle of the pool, 2 Samuel 2, verses 12 through 17. Abner and his men had gathered at Gibeon. Joab and his men gathered at Gibeon facing them. And that's where there was a pool at Gibeon. That's why it's called the Battle of the Pool. Abner proposed a contest between their men, and Joab agreed. This doesn't make much sense to us, but 12 men from each side fought hand to hand, and each man killed and was killed by his opponent. Basically a tie. And then there was a fierce battle that ensued, but God granted victory to Joab and his men, and Abner and his men were in retreat. And then we read about the death of Asahel, the youngest brother of Joab. 2 Samuel 2, verses 18 through 28. Joab's 2 brothers were also there with him. Asahel, the youngest brother of Joab, was a very fast runner, and he outdistanced his brothers and David's other men in pursuing Abner. Abner recognized Asahel as a brother of Joab. He pleaded with Asahel to turn aside and grab spoil from a fallen soldier. Abner may have been pleading with Asahel to put on some armor, or perhaps even to equip himself with a weapon. Abner pleaded with Asahel to turn aside and stop pursuing him because he didn't want to kill him. He didn't want the death of Asahel to stand in the way of their future dealings with each other and to complicate things. Asahel refused to turn aside. Likely he was stricken with some of Joab's negative traits and sought to make a name for himself by killing Abner. Or he didn't look forward to facing Joab and Abishai if he let Abner go without a fight. Abner struck him with the butt of his spear, and this may have meant that Abner was trying to just knock the breath out of him so he couldn't run any farther, to disable him but not kill him. But the spear came out his back, and Asahel died from his wound. And Joab and Abishai continued to pursue Abner. Abner called for a truce, and Joab agreed. But at that time, Joab and Abishai were probably planning for a future revenge. In 2 Samuel 3, verses 22 through 25, Abner went to Hebron under a flag of truce with 20 men. Abner had been reprimanded by Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and he switched loyalties to the house of David. David prepared a feast for Abner and his men. Abner proposed turning over the remainder of the kingdom to David's control, and David sent Abner away with an agreement. Now, this doesn't say much for Abner's character either, because he switched loyalties awfully fast. David prepared a feast for Abner and his men. Oh, I just read that, sorry. Joab and some of David's men returned from a raid. He learned that Abner had just left. He criticized David for trusting Abner. He said that Abner had just come to spy out the camp. He left David's presence and then, without David's knowledge, gave orders to bring Abner back. And then we read about Abner's murder in 2 Samuel 3, verses 26 through 39. Joab took Abner aside for a, quote, private, unquote, meeting. Joab countermanded David's orders to send Abner away in peace, disregarding the fact that Abner had come in peace under flag of truce. Now, Joab may have truly believed that Abner had come as a spy, or perhaps Joab considered that even if Abner had been sincere and succeeded, he might have become commander-in-chief instead of Joab. In any case, Joab killed Abner out of revenge for the killing of his brother Asahel. Or perhaps, okay, I just read that, sorry. David heard of this and mourned Abner's death. David put the blame of blood guilt where it belonged upon Joab and his descendants. David included Joab in the general command to mourn Abner's death. And it's possible that Joab and Abishai conspired together to shed Abner's blood. This is hinted in 2 Samuel 3, verse 30. Now, now by this time, Ishbosheth has been murdered, and there's no one left to take command of the remaining tribes of Israel. So the remaining tribes of Israel come to David to make him king over all Israel. But then the city of the Jebusites still remains as one of the original cities of the Canaanites that was not captured or destroyed. And so David decides that now is the time to capture the city of Jebus and make it his capital. But the Jebusites issued a challenge saying, quote, "David will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," unquote. They thought their city was impregnable. David issued a challenge, quote, "Whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander," unquote. Joab sensed an opportunity. This is where we're going to leave the story. Tune in next month when we find out whether or not David and his men conquered Jebus and whether or not, what part, if any, Joab played in that event. Now we see that Joab obeyed his uncle up to a certain point. He had his own ideas about what to do. But we'll see what happens next month. And let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to look at Joab's life and how he influenced the people around him. And we all realize that we're no better or worse than Joab in your eyes, but you love us anyway, and you sent your own son to die on the cross for us. You love us that much. I pray that you would bless us and dismiss us with your blessing, and I pray that you would bless the food that we're about to partake and bless the hands of those who prepared and served it to us. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.